So, of course, we've already gone through the uh, general structure of the nervous system, where you have the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which consists of all your peripheral nerves outside of the brain and spinal cord, and is divided into your sensory and motor nervous systems. And of course, we also talked about the way that this works is that there's a pathway. You have some sensory receptors being activated, sending a signal through sensory neurons into the central nervous system, where they all get integrated together somehow through various neuronal circuits and neuronal pools. And then there's an output into the motor division where some sort of effect happens. And then the motor division is further subdivided into the somatic nervous system, which specifically goes to skeletal muscle to provide movement of the skeletal muscle. And then there's the autonomic nervous system, which is what this particular lecture portion is about. And the autonomic nervous system goes to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And again, this is under involuntary control. And so through the crash course videos, you're going to learn that you have the sympathetic and a parasympathetic nervous system. You're going to learn how they're wired, what the nerve fibers look like, what the neurotransmitters are, and everything. But then I'm going to go into some further details about more specifics of how the autonomic nervous system works. Again, with the autonomic nervous system, you have the two subdivisions: the sympathetic, which prepares the body to deal with stressful situations, which we commonly refer to as fight or flight. But a lot of attention's been being brought more recently to the fact that there is also something called the freeze response as well. All right, so sympathetic, fight, flight, or freeze. The parasympathetic nervous system, once you're done dealing with that stressful situation, your body has to calm down, because if you are in a constant state of preparing to deal with the stressful situation, that's going to suck a lot of energy from your body and result in pathological conditions. So you need to find a way to bring things down. And so the parasympathetic nervous system is your rest and digest nervous system. And what you'll discover is that both of these branches of the autonomic nervous system go to the same organs, because one ramps things up, the other ramps things down. And they are operating on those organs simultaneously most of the time, but sometimes the balance is switched towards dealing more with a stressful situation, or sometimes the balance is switched more towards dealing with a coming down from that stressful situation. So think of the way that these two systems operate as a balance between each other. All right, so having learned about the autonomic nervous system and the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, it's important to realize that there are multiple pathways that the sympathetic or parasympathetic response can take depending on the needs of the body. So before we go into it, over here you have the somatic nervous system, and here you have the autonomic nervous system, because these pathways can apply to both sympathetic and parasympathetic. So in the generic autonomic nervous system can be useful here. So first off, we have a short reflex. And what a short reflex is you have a sensory receptor sending information that goes directly to a ganglion and synapses directly on the postganglionic cell to produce a very rapid response in the smooth muscle or gland. And over here you see how that can occur. You have a sensation. Here's your sensory neuron synapsing within a ganglion directly onto the postganglionic fiber, which goes to your effector organ. And notice that this short reflex bypasses any portion of the central nervous system, brain or spinal cord. So it's very rapid and results in very rapid responses. Next up the list is your long reflex. And a long reflex, which I'll start over here, you have this sensation that goes into the sensory receptor cell, and that goes and it synapses in the spinal cord. So now we've involved the central nervous system. That synapse that's made in the central nervous system in the spinal cord will then synapse on a motor neuron, an autonomic motor neuron, that will come out, go in your preganglionic fiber, synapse onto your postganglionic fiber, and then send a signal to the effector organ. So this may be the same exact organ that the short reflex went to, but notice that it took a longer response. So the response time for this is going to be a little bit longer than the short reflex. So the real difference between a short and a long reflex is the involvement of the spinal cord and the central nervous system. But you still have not involved the brain in any of these responses. So the third type of autonomic reflex is where the sensory pathway goes up to the brainstem, directs the information to go to the hypothalamus, and in the hypothalamus, the sensory input is compared to set points that are held in the hypothalamus, and then a signal is fed back down to the brainstem and into our autonomic pathway in order to produce a response that's directed by the hypothalamus. Now notice that under some circumstances the limbic system may be involved, or even the cerebral cortex may be involved. So if the cerebral cortex is involved, you have an awareness that this is happening. If the cerebral cortex is not involved and the limbic system is involved, then you may have an emotional response to whatever is happening that's associated with the sensory signaling. And if the limbic system is not involved, then the hypothalamus is just going to regulate what is going on with that particular reflex. So what this does is it sets up 3 levels of control over an autonomic response that gives you the ability to modulate the response to multiple types of sensory input. So just to remind you that visceral afferent fibers are sensory fibers, and they are going to send information from the periphery toward the central nervous system. And visceral efferent fibers are going to send motor impulses from the central nervous system to smooth muscle and glands. So an example of one of these visceral reflexes is, let's say that you have light that is entering the eye. That's going to be picked up by these cells in the retina. That's going to send signals to your brain through the optic nerve, and through that optic nerve going to the brain, your brain's going to say, all right, we're detecting dim light. There's not much light coming through. So that's going to send a signal down to the spinal cord and activate an autonomic reflex. Specifically, this is going to be a sympathetic reflex that's going to go to the preganglionic fiber, activate the postganglionic fiber to the pupillary muscles, and that's going to cause the pupillary muscles to dilate so that you can see better in dim light. However, if the brain tells you that bright light is perceived, well, that's going to send a signal to the parasympathetic nervous system, preganglionic, postganglionic. That's going to go to the pupils, and it's going to cause those pupils to constrict so that not as much light is being let in because you have plenty to be able to see. Okay, so 2 different pathways were stimulated here, but in the end, what happened is that norepinephrine was released that caused the pupils to dilate, and here acetylcholine was released to cause the pupils to constrict. So in the end, it was the neurotransmitters released by these pathways that caused the same organ, being the pupillary muscles, to either dilate or constrict in response to the pathway that was activated. So that suggests that all the effectors, the end organs of the autonomic nervous system, the effectors, are in a balance, a constant balance between sympathetic signals and parasympathetic signals, and the neurotransmitters that are being dumped onto those end organs. Now, we've talked about before how this sympathetic and parasympathetic both go to the same organ and they tend to be in balance, but maybe in some organs, sympathetic is used more often than parasympathetic. And the parasympathetic, or whichever branch is more active, tends to maintain the resting state, and the resting state is known as autonomic tone. An example of this is your blood vessels. Your blood vessels are innervated by sympathetic nervous system only. All right, so we take the parasympathetic out of the equation altogether. And there is always a constant firing of the sympathetic nervous system onto the smooth muscle of blood vessels. And what this does is it maintains the blood vessels at a certain level of contraction or constriction to maintain blood pressure. But when blood pressure needs to change, you can either send more sympathetic signals to cause more vasoconstriction, or you can send less sympathetic nervous system signals to cause more vasodilation. And so in that way, you modulate the tone of the blood vessels in response to sensory signals that are being received. When a nerve fiber is injured or nerve cell is injured, whether it dies or regenerates is dependent upon where the injury actually occurs. If we have an injury to the soma, in other words, the cell body, where the nucleus and all the major organelles of a neuron are housed, that will result in death of the neuron. All right, you're going to lose that neuron forever. You're not going to be able to get it back. Because remember also that neurons don't divide, so there's not going to be another neuron nearby that says, hey, that's missing, I'll divide and take its place. However, if you have damage to the axon, that may result in regeneration. Okay, so here's an example of how that regeneration might occur. So here's your site of injury right here, and notice that this axon is surrounded by Schwann cells, giving that myelin sheath. All right, so distal to the site of injury, you're going to see an atrophy of not only the axon, but you're going to see these Schwann cells also degenerate, or not necessarily the Schwann cells, but the myelin sheath is going to degenerate. All right, so then what will happen is that the proximal end of that neuron may be able to start regrowing through the sheath that these Schwann cells that are left over, even though the myelin's gone, the Schwann cells might still be there. They grow through this sheath that the Schwann cells left behind, and all the other connective tissue that's surrounding it left behind, and it can still grow back to its target. Okay, now when it grows back to its target, it may not exactly innervate the same place. It may innervate someplace slightly different. So often when you have regeneration of axons in the peripheral nervous system, people have to relearn how to move, because sometimes those axons will target a slightly different place than where they were targeted before. Now, if you don't have connective tissue and Schwann cells that were left over that can make a sheath that will guide the axon back to its target, then it's not likely you're going to regenerate that axon, and you won't regain function of that nerve pathway following the injury. Now, I'll also say at this point that if you happen to have injury to dendrites as well, there's a possibility that those can grow back also. So the previous slide described what happens if nerves regenerate in the peripheral nervous system. In the central nervous system, if an axon is separated from its cell body due to injury, the distal portion of the axon will degenerate, much like you saw with the peripheral nervous system. Axons within the central nervous system lack that sheath that surrounds the axon that was there. And because that sheath is not there, if the end of the damaged neuron starts to grow, there's no sheath cell to guide it, and therefore the regeneration of the pathway that that nerve cell once belonged to will no longer be functional. And one of the reasons why the regeneration is not likely because you don't have the neurolemma is that the oligodendrocytes, which do the equivalent job of Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system, they don't proliferate following injury. So if you lose the myelin sheath in the central nervous system, the oligodendrocytes will not give you a new myelin sheath. Therefore, you're not going to have a path for that axon to be guided, and you're not going to have that regrowth.